Hello and welcome to the very first episode of Essex by the Sea. I'm Owen Ward and I'll be exploring the coast of Essex on this podcast, finding out about and hearing the amazing stories from this diverse part of the world. Before meeting my guest, I'd really appreciate it if you would subscribe wherever you get your podcasts from. You can find us on Spotify, Google Podcasts and iTunes, as well as many other places. And don't forget to tell your friends about Essex by the Sea and encourage them to subscribe too. World Oyster Day is celebrated during the month of August, but why should we get excited by these? There's records as far back as the Domesday Book in 1086 of oyster beds off the Essex coast, and exports peaked in 1682 with 4,000 bushels shipped overseas. The tide turned though in the 20th century with the number of oysters plummeting. So what does the future hold? Dr. Alice Lown is researching native oysters at the University of Essex and joins me on this episode of Essex by the Sea. Thanks very much for joining me, Alice.
No problem.
First of all, what are oysters and where are they found?
So oysters are bivalves, which means they are shelled creatures which live in the sea with two halves to their shells. They filter feed, so they draw in water and then they eat all the algae from the water so that they can survive. In England, there's two different species of oysters. One is native, called the native oyster, and one is not native, and that is the rock oyster. So the native oysters are the oysters that I work with, but the rock oysters are also very commonly found all around the coast of Essex as well, and they're more likely to be the ones that you might encounter in restaurants, and a lot more common because they are farmed as opposed to wild.
Is Essex the ideal habitat for oysters?
Well, yes, we have excellent habitat here. We have very high nutrients in the water. We have nice shallow areas for the oysters to grow. They really like estuarine areas, so some inputs of fresh water can be good, although they do actually live in fully saline areas. Records actually date back to Roman times for these oysters, and so native oysters have been around in Essex for over 2,000 years.
I've seen recently that the native oyster in Europe, they're down below 5% compared to sort of historical figures. What's the main threat to them?
So there's many threats to oysters. Overfishing, disease, habitat change. So if they've had any kind of difference in their habitat due to development in the area, for example, this can really impact oysters. Hugely impacted by sedimentation, so that they get buried by sediment in the water. Invasive species, so we've got a couple of invasive species here in Essex. We've got the slipper limpet, which tend to grow in the same habitat which oysters live in, and also the American oyster drill, stingwinkle, I think it's called.
and they're not helping oyster numbers of the native variety here, though?
No, they're both impacting the native oysters. So their native oysters have definitely declined in number quite dramatically over the past 100 years.
Now, the Blackwater, the Crouch, the Roach, the Colne estuaries were designated as a marine conservation zone in 2013, making this, I've read, the largest inshore protected zone in the UK. Do you think this has helped the numbers, or is it still too early to tell?
Whilst it is too early to tell in terms of direct numbers yet, we are very hopeful. This has definitely helped with helping us raise awareness of the presence of the native oyster in the area, and also bring in funding for a lot of research in how to direct this restoration of this species. So we know which direction to take things in, as opposed to just leaving things as they were.
You're researching the native oyster of Essex here at the University of Essex. What's your aim for this work?
So we want to currently understand how the native oyster responds to changes in temperature, which is what I'm looking at the moment. I've also developed a model with Tom Cameron, my supervisor, to make predictions over the population. So we are trying to understand what the population is like at the moment and what it might be in the future given certain different scenarios. So we understand their growth rates and their survival and how many juvenile oysters are showing up in the population, and we use all this information to then make predictions and understand where best to direct restoration efforts.
What's the lifespan of an oyster then? I mean, how long do they live for?
So they can live for up to 20 years, maybe even more. So they are a very, very long-lived species. But usually if you have them on your plate, they're probably between 4 to 5, 6 maybe years old. So they do live for a very long time. And so they are quite susceptible to any changes in their adult population.
Now, you mentioned about the research that you're doing in terms of the change in temperature on oysters, and I recently saw that you were measuring the respiration rates of them. Tell me more about that. I mean, how do you measure the breaths that an oyster takes?
Yeah, so basically what I've been doing, I've made these little chambers, and inside these little chambers I have an oyster in the water and a little tiny sensor dot, which changes colour ever so slightly due to the amount of oxygen in the water. So I'll put this at different temperatures, and I can then measure the change in oxygen within the water for the oyster at different temperatures.
And is it a bit too early to tell what you found from that research?
A little bit too early to tell still at the moment. I haven't done any final analysis, but what we're hoping to find is understanding if there is a cut-off temperature or a peak temperature which oysters can withstand, above which they become very stressed, and that impacts their breathing rates. So that's what we're trying to understand at the moment. Is there a specific temperature where oysters get really stressed out?
I guess with the increase in temperature in terms of climate change, 2020 has been a very hot summer so far. I mean, do the sea temperatures vary greatly here in Essex?
Yeah, so because we've got such shallow seas around Essex, the temperatures are actually really high. My supervisor was out with another one of his PhD students, Howard, on Friday, and they were working in the salt marshes and recorded temperatures above 22 degrees already, and this is just the beginning of the hot weather that we're having. So last year we recorded temperatures of 25 degrees in some areas of Essex, so they are certainly very, very high temperatures, particularly in comparison to places like Cornwall, which gets all the Atlantic Ocean, which seems to be a little bit cooler.
So quite high temperatures then. I mean, are there other factors that the oysters are struggling with?
Yes, so another factor that was really impacting the numbers of native oysters is a disease called bonamia. So it was first detected in Essex in the 80s and has caused huge declines of the oyster. And so we've really been struggling with that, although in recent years it seems to be that the oyster in Essex anyway is managing quite well and actually growing to good sizes, which shows that there seems to be some resilience to the disease. But there's a lot of research going on throughout Europe looking into how to understand and control and work with and against this disease.
You mentioned your colleagues who are sort of out in the field in the estuaries. Do you get a chance to go and get your feet wet?
Oh yes, I do. Well, so I've got other experiments in the estuary which have oysters attached to strings, and I can bring them up at regular intervals and I can see their growth and survival rates of oysters in situ, so I know what the oyster population is doing on the ground under the ocean. So I like to go out and go on the boats there and measure all the oysters that I can.
I've got visions of you now sort of tugging at this string and then sort of like a really long line of hundreds of oysters suddenly popping up out of the water. I mean, how do you attach an oyster to a piece of string?
So I keep them at 20 oysters per string, otherwise it definitely gets tangled up very, very quickly. But we attach oysters onto strings using a substance called milliput. It's just basically a bit like plasticine, but it cures underwater, and the oyster can then stay attached to the string and bring it up. I've also done other field work as well. For my PhD, I worked here at Essex again. I worked with the Kent and Essex Inshore Fisheries Conservation Authority, and I went with them doing their oyster surveys, looking at all the biodiversity that we could find in the areas and associating that with the native oyster populations.
It's amazing, and the work that goes on, in terms of research around the coast is fascinating and unseen by a lot of people, because it is, in the estuaries of our rivers, or a little bit further out from our coast, or hidden away in laboratories like here at the university. What do you think the future holds for oysters, particularly native ones here in Essex?
So in Essex we also have a group called Inori, and they are a group of researchers, fishermen, anybody interested in the native oyster. There's charities, ZSL involved, huge group of people involved, dedicated to restoring this native oyster. And for this, we have now got a huge box called the Restoration Box in the Blackwater Estuary, where we are trialling different substrates for juvenile oysters to settle onto. We are looking at different ways to boost native oyster populations on the ground at quite large scales, which we hope to then scale up. So there's on-the-ground research going on at all times with lots of different people involved, and so I have a lot of faith that with this huge amount of expertise we have here in Essex, that we've got a lot of oysters for a good long years to come.
In terms of your research, what's next for the programme?
So we have this continuing, my research looking at the temperature dependence and the respiration of oysters. This is due to end next year, so we have quite a lot of time left, still looking at the survival rates of oysters and growth rates of oysters depending on different temperatures. Going to quite high temperatures, going up to 30 degrees at the moment, which you don't really find in Essex in the waters at the moment, but could do in the future. We've also got other PhD students working with rock oysters. So there's Alex Shakespeare working with the Colchester oyster fishery. He's working with rock oysters, which are the more farmed oysters. But we're always looking for new projects. Also, Inori, their whole team of people, they're always working in the restoration box, finding out new information, always doing surveys, and putting down oyster spat collectors to look at the recruitment, so how many juvenile oysters settle during the year. So there's always work going on here in Essex.
And I know you're very busy today, so thank you ever so much for joining me here on the Essex by the Sea podcast, Alice.
Thanks ever so much.
Well, if you've enjoyed the podcast and want to hear more stories from the Essex coast, don't forget to subscribe to the podcast in the same place that you found this episode. An episode would land on the 1st and the 15th of each month, so make sure you don't miss it. We're also across social media, so follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Essex by the Sea, and like our Facebook page. Next time on Essex by the Sea, Chris Howard is actually walking the entire Essex coast, all 350 miles of it, and he's not stopping there because he's actually walking the whole coastline of the UK.
It is hard, and it's probably the hardest bit for me at the moment, although I'm saying that sat here with blue skies and sunshine all around me on the seaside. In a few months' time I'll be thinking exactly the same thing. It's really hard missing my children, but the weather will have completely changed and it'll be cold all the time, I'll be wet, and I often won't know where I'm staying.
I do hope you can join me for that. Until then, thanks for listening.